My name is Michael Hayes, and this happened to me back in 1967 when I was working as a park ranger in Olympic National Park, Washington. I was 32 then, and I'd been a ranger for almost 7 years. Everything I'm about to tell you is true, though I wish it wasn't. It was early October, and we were expecting a lunar eclipse that night. The kind of eclipse that turns the moon blood red, something that always brought more visitors to the park than usual. The air was crisp, leaves were turning golden and red, and there was that special autumn smell in the air, like dried leaves and wood smoke. I started my evening patrol just as the sun was setting. My partner, Tom, was covering the south side of the park while I took the north. We kept in touch through our radios, checking in every hour like we always did. Everything seemed normal at first. Just another beautiful evening in the park. The eclipse was supposed to start around 9 p.m. I parked my truck at one of the lookout points to watch it begin. The moon was full and bright, and slowly a shadow started creeping across its face. That's when things began to feel different. The forest got quieter than usual. Now, I'd spent enough nights in these woods to know what normal silence sounds like. But this was different. It was like every animal, every insect, every living thing was holding its breath, waiting for something. I remember checking my watch. It was 9:17 p.m. when I heard the first howl. That howl, it wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. I'd been around wolves and coyotes my whole career, but this sound was wrong. It was deeper, almost like a human voice trying to copy a wolf, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. I grabbed my radio. "Tom, you hearing this?" I waited, but all I got was static. That wasn't normal. We always had good reception in this area. Another howl came, closer this time. My hand shook a little as I turned on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, showing nothing but trees and shadows. The red moon hung above me like a giant eye watching everything. I decided to check it out. That was my job, after all. As I walked into the woods, my boots crunching on dead leaves, I noticed something strange. There were no cricket sounds, no hooting owls, nothing. Just that awful silence between the howls. The radio crackled. "Mike, Mike, you there?" It was Tom, but his voice sounded scared. "I'm seeing something weird near Cedar Creek. Some kind of tracks. Big ones. And there's blood. Stay put," I told him. "I'm coming to you." But before I could get back to my truck, I saw something that made my blood run cold. About 50 yards ahead, in the beam of my flashlight, was a group of elk, or what was left of them. They were laid out in a perfect circle, like someone had arranged them that way, but it was how they were cut open that really got to me. The cuts were clean, straight, like they'd been done with surgical tools, not teeth or claws. I'd seen bear attacks, wolf kills, mountain lion work. This wasn't anything like those. This was something else. Something that knew exactly what it was doing. The howls came again, and this time they were answered by others. They were all around me now, and they sounded hungry. That's when I saw something glinting in my flashlight beam. At first, I thought it was just water on rocks, but as I got closer, I realized I was looking at ancient rock carvings, petroglyphs we call them. In all my years working here, I'd never seen these before. The carvings were weird. They showed what looked like wolves, but they were standing up like people. Some had tools in their hands, and others wore what seemed like necklaces. Around these wolf people were smaller figures, regular humans, running away or lying on the ground. My hands were shaking as I took photos with my camera. The old stories from local tribes started coming back to me, tales about wolf spirits that hunted during blood moons. I'd always thought they were just stories to scare kids around campfires. Now, I wasn't so sure. The radio sparked to life again. "Mike." Tom's voice was just a whisper now. "They're here. I can see them. They're not. They're not normal wolves. They're walking on two legs. I'm hiding in the old ranger station, but they're trying to get in. They're smart, Mike. Too smart." Then I heard it, a scratching sound behind me. Not like animal claws on dirt, but like fingernails on wood. I turned around slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There they were. 3 pairs of eyes reflecting red in my light, about 6 feet off the ground. They were standing upright, just like in the rock carvings. I could see their breath in the cold air. And their teeth. Oh God, their teeth. I didn't just feel scared. I felt like a rabbit that suddenly realizes it's being watched by a wolf. Only these weren't normal wolves. And I wasn't their only target. I ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. Behind me, I could hear them moving through the trees. They weren't charging at me like normal wolves would. No. They were taking their time, working together, trying to herd me in a certain direction. "Tom!" I shouted into my radio as I ran. "Tom, if you can hear me, get out of that station. They're trying to trap you." All I got back was static. I heard screams in the distance. Not Tom's voice, but others. Hikers. I had forgotten there were still people up here watching the eclipse. My heart felt like it was going to burst, but I turned toward the screams. That's my job, to protect people in this park. As I got closer, I saw them, a young couple backed up against a cliff wall. 2 of the wolf creatures were closing in on them, moving like people in wolf costumes, except this was no costume. Their movements were too smooth, too natural. One of them was holding something that looked like a crude knife made of stone. The hikers saw me and yelled for help. I did the only thing I could think of. I fired my gun in the air. The creatures turned to look at me, and in the red moonlight, I saw intelligence in their eyes. They weren't just animals. They were thinking, planning. One of them made a sound, not a howl this time, but something that sounded almost like words. The others responded. They were talking to each other. That's when I realized we were all in much bigger trouble than I'd thought. These things weren't just hunting us. They were hunting us for a reason. And as I stood there, watching them communicate, I knew we were dealing with something that should not exist in our world. The ground around us was dry from weeks without rain. I had matches in my pocket, and suddenly I knew what I had to do. Sometimes the only way to fight monsters is to become scary yourself. I pulled out my matches and my park map. The paper caught fire quickly, and I threw it into a patch of dry leaves. The flames spread faster than I expected. The forest was like kindling after months of dry weather. "Run!" I shouted to the hikers, pointing them toward the main road. "Keep going and don't look back." The wolf creatures didn't like the fire. They backed away, making those strange talking sounds again. I could see more of them now in the growing light of the flames, at least 6 or 7. The fire was spreading in a line between us and them. But then I heard Tom scream. I ran toward his voice, the heat of the fire on my back. The old ranger station was about a quarter mile away. When I got there, the door was broken open. Inside, I found Tom's flashlight on the floor, still on. But no Tom. More howls filled the air, but this time they sounded angry, scared even. The fire was growing bigger than I'd planned. It was everywhere now, turning the night as bright as day. Through the smoke, I saw shapes running, some on 2 legs, some on 4. I couldn't tell which were the wolf creatures anymore. I made it back to my truck just as the fire really took hold. The whole ridge was burning now. As I drove down the mountain road, I saw the hikers I'd saved. They were running, so I picked them up. But Tom, we never found Tom, or the other 2 hikers who'd been in the park that night. The fire burned for 3 days. The newspapers called it a tragedy, blamed it on careless campers. Nobody believed my story about what really happened. They said the eclipse and the smoke played tricks on my eyes. Maybe they're right. But sometimes, on full moon nights, I still hear those howls. And they don't sound like wolves at all. They sound like something that's waiting for another blood moon, another chance to hunt. I'm retired now, but I still keep matches with me, just in case. Because I know they're out there, and I know what they can do. My name is Jack Thompson, and this happened to me back in 1954, when I was working as a ranger in the Boundary Waters of Minnesota. I'll never forget it. Not a single detail. How could I? Every time I look at where my right arm used to be, the memories come flooding back. Before I tell you what happened in those woods, you should know a bit about me. I'd just come back from serving in Korea about a year earlier. I thought I'd seen the worst that life could throw at me over there, but I was wrong. Dead wrong. The war had taught me how to stay calm in tough situations, how to track and how to survive. I never imagined I'd need those skills back home in Minnesota. I took the ranger job because I wanted peace and quiet. The wilderness seemed like the perfect place to clear my head after everything I'd seen overseas. Most days, it was just me, the trees, and the occasional hiker needing directions. But that winter changed everything. It started with missing hikers. First one, then another, then a third. Now, people get lost in the Boundary Waters all the time. It's a vast place. Easy to lose your way if you don't know what you're doing. But something about these disappearances felt different, wrong. The hikers were experienced outdoorsmen, not some city folks who'd wandered off the trail. They knew these woods almost as well as I did. That's when I started finding things. Strange things. Things that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, just like it used to in Korea, when we knew the enemy was watching us from the hills. It was during my 3rd week of searching that I found the first warning sign. I was checking some of the older hiking trails when I spotted something carved into a massive old oak tree. At first, I thought it was just regular trail markings or maybe some kids' initials. But these were different, deep, ancient carvings in a language I didn't recognize, with strange symbols that looked like twisted faces and antlers. I took some photos and showed them to Bill Running Bear, one of the local tribal elders I'd become friends with. When he saw them, his usual cheerful face went dead serious. He told me they were warnings about the Wendigo, an ancient evil spirit that haunts these woods. I'll be honest, I didn't believe in such things back then. I'd seen real horrors in Korea. Monsters were just stories to scare kids, but then I started finding the animals. First, it was a deer, or what was left of it. The thing had been torn apart, but not like how a bear or wolf would do it. The bite marks were huge, bigger than anything I'd ever seen, and the way it was positioned, it looked like something had been playing with it, like a cat with a mouse. More dead animals showed up over the next few days. Each one was worse than the last. But the strangest thing was the tracks. They started normal enough, like bare human footprints in the snow, but longer and deeper. Then they'd just stop. Not like someone had covered them up or jumped somewhere. They'd just end mid-step, as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air. The whole time I was investigating, I had this feeling. You know that feeling when you're being watched? Like in Korea, when we knew snipers were in the trees, it was like that, but worse. The woods got quieter too. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Even the wind seemed afraid to blow through the trees. I radioed back to base about what I'd found, trying to sound professional and calm. But deep down I was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, Bill's stories weren't just stories after all. The deeper I got into the investigation, the worse things became. More people went missing. Not just hikers anymore, but locals too. A hunter named Mike, who'd lived here his whole life. Then Sarah, a wildlife photographer who was supposed to be shooting pictures of winter birds. They both vanished without a trace. I started spending longer hours in the woods, following any lead I could find. The temperatures kept dropping, hitting way below zero. But the cold wasn't what bothered me. It was the silence. No matter where I went, it felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. One evening, I found an abandoned campsite. The tent was still standing, but something was wrong. The sleeping bag inside was torn to shreds, and there were claw marks on the trees around the camp. Not low like a bear would make, but high up, maybe 15 feet off the ground. What got me most was the smell. If you've ever smelled something dead, you know it's awful. But this was different, like rotting meat mixed with wet fur and something else I can't even describe. I followed the tracks leading away from the camp. They started as those same bare human footprints, but bigger this time, and deeper, like whatever made them was getting heavier. The strange thing was, there were pieces of frozen meat scattered along the trail. Not animal meat, it looked store-bought, like someone had raided a butcher shop. But we hadn't had any reports of break-ins in town. That's when I heard it for the first time, a sound that still haunts my dreams. It was like a scream, but not quite human. More like a howl, but not quite animal either. It echoed through the trees, bouncing around until I couldn't tell where it was coming from. My military training kicked in, and I stayed perfectly still, listening. Then I heard branches breaking somewhere in the darkness, like something big was moving through the forest. I radioed for backup. 3 other rangers, Steve, Mike, and Dave, said they'd head out first thing in the morning to help me search. I set up camp for the night, but I didn't sleep. I couldn't. That sound kept coming, getting closer each time. And I swear, between each howl, I could hear something that sounded like words, like someone calling out in pain. Looking back now, I wish I'd told those rangers to stay away. Maybe they'd still be alive if I had. What happened next is still hard for me to talk about, even after all these years. But people need to know the truth. The sun was just starting to rise when I saw it. The morning was dead quiet. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and my boots crunching in the snow. I'd followed those strange tracks to a clearing, and that's where I found myself face to face with something that shouldn't exist. It was tall, so tall it made the pine trees look small. Its body was like a human's, but wrong somehow. The skin was pulled tight over its bones, like it was starving to death, but it was strong, so strong. On its head were antlers, like a deer's but bigger and twisted. But its face, Its face was the worst part. It looked almost human, with eyes that seemed to know things, horrible things. And its mouth, rows of teeth like broken glass, stained dark with what I knew wasn't berry juice. I reached for my rifle, but it moved faster than anything that big should be able to move. In 1 second, it was 30 feet away. In the next, it was right in front of me. I got one shot off. I know I hit it, but it didn't even flinch. That's when it grabbed my right arm. I don't remember much after that. Just the pain, the cold, and the sound of my own screaming. I remember falling, rolling down a hill. When I looked up, it was gone, but so was my arm, torn off clean at the shoulder. Somehow, I made it back to my truck. The doctors later said it was a miracle I didn't bleed to death. They tried to tell me it must have been a bear, but I know what I saw. Bears don't walk on two legs. Bears don't have antlers. And bears don't whisper your name in the dark. The next day, Steve, Mike, and Dave went looking for the creature. They had rifles, flares, everything they might need. They radioed in when they found my blood in the snow. That was the last anyone ever heard from them. That was 30 years ago, and I still work as a ranger in these woods. Not out in the field anymore. My missing arm made sure of that. But I handle the paperwork and train new rangers. Every winter, when the snow starts falling, I make sure to warn them about what's out there. Most don't believe me, of course. They look at my missing arm and nod politely, probably thinking I'm just a crazy old man who had a run-in with a bear. But sometimes, when they come back from their patrols with that look in their eyes, that scared, haunted look, I know they've heard it. That screaming howl echoing through the trees, that whisper in the darkness. The missing persons cases were never solved. They're just dusty files in a cabinet now, marked unsolved in red ink. Steve, Mike, and Dave's families still hold out hope that someday they'll find out what happened. I know they never will. Bill Running Bear passed away a few years back, but before he died, he told me something important. He said the Wendigo isn't just a monster, it's hunger itself. It's what happens when the wilderness decides to hunt back. And it never, ever stops being hungry. So if you're ever up here in the Boundary Waters, and you hear something that sounds almost human calling your name through the trees, or see tracks in the snow that just disappear, don't follow them. Don't try to be brave. Just run. Run as fast as you can, because I only lost an arm. The next person might not be so lucky. My name is Robert Wilson, and this happened to me back in 1973 when I was working as a park ranger at Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. I still have nightmares about it, even after all these years. Sometimes I wake up screaming, feeling grateful that I can't see the horrors in my dreams anymore. Yes, I'm blind now, but maybe that's a blessing after what I witnessed down there in the deep dark. I was 32 then, with 15 years of caving experience under my belt. Everyone called me Cave Bob because I knew Mammoth Cave's tunnels like the back of my hand. I'd helped with dozens of rescue missions before, pulling out lost tourists, injured spelunkers, and even some kids who'd wandered too far from their school groups. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened that summer. It started with a phone call at 3 a.m. A group of 5 college students had gone missing during their cave exploration. They were supposed to come out 12 hours earlier, and their parents were frantic. I remember how the phone rang in my little ranger cabin, cutting through the cricket sounds of that warm Kentucky night. Something felt different about this call from the start. Maybe it was the way my coffee cup trembled in my hand, or how the moths beating against my porch light seemed more desperate than usual. I made some calls and put together my best rescue team. Mike Thompson, our medical expert who'd patched up more twisted ankles than I could count. Sarah Chen, who was small enough to squeeze through tight spaces but strong as an ox. And the Davis twins, Tom and Tim, who were our equipment specialists. Looking back now, I wish I'd never called any of them. Sometimes I can still hear their voices echoing in those dark tunnels. We entered the cave at dawn. The morning sun was just peeking over the hills. But where we were going, sunlight wouldn't matter. I remember checking everyone's helmets and lights one last time. You can never be too careful underground. Our footsteps echoed off the limestone walls as we made our way deeper into Mammoth Cave. Standard rescue formation, I told my team. Sarah, you're behind me. Davis twins in the middle with the heavy gear, and Mike, you watch our backs. The cave air felt cooler than usual that day, and our breath came out in little white puffs. The first hour was normal, just the usual dripping water and the crunch of our boots on rocky ground. We followed the marked tourist paths at first, our lights bouncing off the wet walls. But then we had to turn onto one of the less traveled tunnels, where the missing students were supposed to have gone. That's when things started feeling wrong. Bob, Sarah called out softly, her light beam pointing at something on the ground. Look at this. It was a backpack, one that belonged to the missing students. Next to it lay a camera, its lens cracked. A few energy bar wrappers were scattered nearby, along with a water bottle that was still half full. But there was something odd about how everything was arranged. It didn't look like someone had dropped these things in a panic. It looked more like they had been placed there. They wouldn't just leave their gear like this, Tom Davis whispered. His twin brother nodded in agreement. Mike picked up the backpack, checking for clues. The straps aren't torn, he said. No signs of a fall or struggle. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I noticed something else. The dust on the cave floor around the items was smooth, undisturbed. No footprints leading away. It was as if the students had vanished into thin air. Then we heard it, a sound that didn't belong in any cave I'd ever been in. It was like a whisper, but not quite human, more like the sound wind makes when it blows through a narrow crack. Except there was no wind down here. We all froze listening. Maybe it's just air pressure from the upper levels, Tim suggested, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. I shined my light down the tunnel ahead. The beam seemed to get swallowed up by the darkness faster than it should have. Let's keep moving, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But stay close. Something's not right here. Little did I know, we were about to find out just how wrong things were going to get. We pushed deeper into the cave, following a narrow tunnel I'd never seen before. That's when Sarah spotted something strange on the wall. Symbols that seemed to glow with a faint blue-green light, like those glow-stick bracelets kids wear at fairs. But these weren't made by any modern paint or chemical. They looked ancient, like they'd been carved there thousands of years ago. This isn't possible, Mike whispered, reaching out to touch one of the symbols. How are they glowing without any power source? I'd been in every mapped section of Mammoth Cave, but this was new. The symbols formed patterns, circles within circles, strange squiggly lines that reminded me of snakes, and shapes that looked almost like stick figures, but not quite human. Look at the floor, Tom called out, his voice shaking. There were more symbols there, making a path deeper into the cave. And they were getting brighter the further they went. That's when we heard it again, that weird whisper sound, but louder this time. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in. "Wilson," she said, "my light's getting dimmer." She was right. All our lights were growing weaker, like something was sucking the power out of them. But the glowing symbols provided enough light to see by, casting everything in that eerie blue-green glow. Tim was taking pictures with his camera, the flash seeming weak and pitiful against the cave walls. "This could be the biggest archaeological discovery ever," he said excitedly. "We need to document everything." But something in my gut told me these weren't the kind of discoveries meant to be found. The air had gotten colder, and there was a smell I'd never encountered in a cave before, something old and musty, like wet paper left to rot for centuries. We found what looked like an entrance to a larger chamber ahead. The glowing symbols formed an arch around it, pulsing now, almost like they were alive. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to get my team out of there. But we still had 5 missing students to find. "Stay together," I ordered, my voice sounding too loud in the strange silence that had fallen. "Whatever you do, don't touch any more of the symbols." If only we'd listened to my gut feeling and turned around right then. But we didn't. We stepped through that arch, into a chamber that would change our lives forever. For those of us who made it out alive, that is. The chamber we entered was huge, bigger than a football field. Our weakening lights barely reached the ceiling. Those glowing symbols were everywhere now, making weird shadows dance on the walls. That's when we first started losing people. Tim Davis was at the back of the group, still taking pictures. I heard him say, "Hey, did you guys see that?" And then, nothing. When I turned around, he was gone. Just gone. No sound, no struggle, like he'd vanished into thin air. "Tim?" Tom's voice cracked as he called for his twin brother. "Tim!" We all started shouting, our voices bouncing off the walls until they didn't even sound human anymore. Mike ran back to where Tim had been standing, shining his light everywhere. But there was nothing, not even footprints in the dusty cave floor. "Everyone hold hands now," I ordered. I could feel Sarah's hand trembling in mine. Tom grabbed my other hand so tight it hurt, but I didn't mind. Mike took up the rear, his medical kit rattling as he moved. We stood there in a line, trying to decide what to do, when Sarah suddenly screamed. "Something touched my leg," she yelled. "Something cold." That's when Mike's voice came from behind us. "There's movement in the shadows. I think I see." His words cut off mid-sentence. We spun around, still holding hands. But Mike was gone too. His flashlight lay on the ground, rolling slightly, the beam growing weaker and weaker, until it died completely. Tom started crying, not loud sobs, but quiet tears running down his face. I couldn't blame him. He'd lost his brother, and now we'd lost Mike too. Our own lights were almost dead now, leaving us in that creepy blue-green glow from the symbols. "We have to go back," Sarah whispered. "Bob, please, we have to go back." But when we turned around, the tunnel we'd come through was gone. The wall was solid rock, covered in those glowing symbols. We were trapped. And then we heard it, not a whisper this time, but a sound like bare feet slapping against stone coming from the darkness ahead of us. Lots of feet, getting closer. The slapping sounds of feet got closer and closer. Sarah, Tom, and I backed up against the wall, holding on to each other. Our last flashlight flickered and died, leaving us in nothing but that strange blue-green glow from the symbols. That's when we saw them. They came shuffling out of the darkness, pale white figures that looked almost human, but wrong in ways that made my stomach turn. They were skinny, with long arms that nearly touched the ground. Their skin was as white as paper, like it had never seen the sun. But it was their faces that made Sarah start screaming. Where eyes should be, they just had smooth, pale skin with tiny dents, like their eyes had been closed for so many generations they'd disappeared completely. There must have been 20 of them, moving towards us like they could see us perfectly in the dark. Behind them I spotted something that made my blood run cold. A pile of bones, some old and yellow, some still fresh. Among them were backpacks and clothing that looked like they belonged to the missing students. "Run!" I yelled, pulling Sarah and Tom with me. We stumbled through the darkness, trying to get away from those things. Their bare feet slapped against the stone behind us, getting closer and closer. Tom tripped and fell. I reached for him, but my hand grabbed nothing but air. His scream echoed through the chamber, then suddenly cut off. Sarah's grip on my other hand tightened. The creatures were all around us now. I could smell them, a musty, ancient smell like old paper and wet stone. One of them reached out and touched my face with fingers that felt ice cold and slightly wet, like a fish's belly. Sarah let out a horrible scream next to me. I turned to help her, but her hand was torn from mine. In the glow of the symbols, I saw them dragging her away into the darkness. I tried to run after her, but more of those pale hands grabbed at me from every direction. That's when the symbols on the walls started pulsing brighter and brighter, until the light was so intense it felt like it was burning through my skull. The last thing I saw before everything went black forever was dozens of those eyeless faces surrounding me, their mouths opening to reveal teeth that glowed with the same blue-green light as the symbols. I don't remember exactly how I escaped. It's all a blur of pain and darkness. I remember running, stumbling, crawling, my eyes burning like they were on fire. I remember the sound of those creatures behind me, their hands grabbing at my clothes, trying to pull me back. Somehow, I found a crack in the wall that felt different. There was fresh air coming through it. I squeezed myself into it, feeling the rough stones scraping my skin. The creatures tried to follow, but they were too big for the narrow gap. I could hear them making these horrible screeching sounds as I pushed myself forward, inch by inch. I crawled for what felt like hours, my eyes still burning, seeing nothing but flashing blue-green lights, even though I had them squeezed shut. Eventually, my hands felt something different, grass. I had somehow made it to an opening on the hillside, half a mile from where we'd entered the cave. They found me there 2 days later, curled up in a ball, my eyes swollen shut. The doctors at the hospital tried everything they could, but my eyes were permanently damaged. They said it looked like I'd stared at the sun for hours. Nobody believed my story, of course. They searched the cave but found no glowing symbols, no chamber full of bones, no pale creatures. They didn't even find the bodies of my team or the missing students. The official report said we'd probably gotten lost, and the others had fallen into some deep pit that nobody could find. But I know what I saw. Sometimes at night, I can still hear those bare feet slapping against stone, still feel those cold, wet fingers on my face. Maybe being blind isn't so bad. At least I don't have to see those eyeless faces in my nightmares anymore. They sealed off that part of Mammoth Cave after what happened. Said it was structurally unsafe. But I know the real reason. Something down there has been hiding in the dark for thousands of years. And that's where it should stay. I still wonder about what those glowing symbols meant, And about all those bones we found, how many other people did those things take before us? How many since? All I know is that sometimes late at night, I hear on the news about hikers or cavers going missing in the Kentucky hills, and I wonder if they found another way into those deep, dark tunnels where the pale creatures live. The worst part? Those creatures are probably still down there, waiting in the darkness, hungry for their next visitors. So if you ever go caving and you see strange symbols starting to glow on the walls, run. Run as fast as you can before the darkness takes you too. My name is David Miller, and this happened to me back in 1981 when I was working as a park ranger in Okefenokee Swamp, Georgia. I was 32 then, and I'd been a ranger for almost 7 years. I loved that swamp, every tree, every bird, and even the grumpy old alligators that sunbathed on the banks. It was my home, and I knew every inch of it. Or at least, I thought I did. It all started in early June. The air was thick and heavy with humidity, typical for Georgia summers. I was doing my usual rounds, checking on the fishing spots and making sure tourists weren't getting themselves into trouble. That's when old Joe Baker, one of our regular fishermen, came up to me with a worried look on his face. "Something ain't right with the water, Ranger Dave," he said, pointing at the creek where he'd been fishing for the past 20 years. "Fish don't look normal, and the water, it smells different." At first, I didn't think much of it. We'd had complaints before, sometimes about trash, sometimes about smells from rotting vegetation. That's normal in a swamp. But Joe was different. He knew the swamp almost as well as I did, and when he said something was wrong, I knew I had to take it seriously. The next day, I took my boat out to Blackwater Creek, the area Joe had mentioned. Everything looked normal at first. The cypress trees were standing tall with their Spanish moss swaying in the breeze, and I could hear the familiar sounds of birds and insects. But as I went deeper into the creek, I noticed something odd. The usual brownish swamp water had a strange, oily sheen to it. And the smell, Joe was right. It wasn't the usual swamp smell. It was something else, something chemical. Little did I know that this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would change my life forever. Over the next few days, I noticed things that made my skin crawl. First, it was the frogs. I found some near the creek that just didn't look right. They were bigger than normal, and their skin had weird bumps and patches. One of them had an extra leg growing from its side. In my years as a ranger, I'd never seen anything like it. Then there were the fish. A kid fishing with his dad caught one that had 2 heads. The father laughed it off, saying it was just a mutant, but I could see how scared the boy was. I was scared too, even though I tried not to show it. I spent hours searching through old maps and documents in my office. That's when I found something interesting. There used to be a mining operation near Blackwater Creek back in the 1950s. They'd closed it down suddenly, and nobody really knew why. But what if they'd left something behind? Something that was only now leaking into our water? One evening, as the sun was setting, I saw something that made me question everything I knew about my swamp. I was in my boat, taking water samples, when I noticed a soft blue glow coming from under the water. At first, I thought it was just the last rays of sunlight playing tricks on my eyes, but then it moved. It wasn't like any fish or alligator I'd ever seen. It was more like someone had poured glowing paint into the water. But this light seemed to have a purpose, like it was searching for something. I reached down to touch the water, but at the last second, something in my gut told me to pull back. Good thing I did, because right then, I saw a small turtle swim through that glowing patch. Within seconds, it flipped onto its back, dead. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what I'd seen. Something was very wrong in my swamp, and I had a feeling it was about to get much worse. The next week, everything changed. Bobby and Jim Harris, two brothers who'd been fishing in these waters since they were kids, went missing. I found their boat the next morning, drifting empty near Blackwater Creek. What made my heart stop was the blood. There was so much of it, smeared across the boat's seats and sides. Their fishing gear was scattered everywhere, like they'd been in a terrible fight. The police came, of course. They searched for 3 days but found nothing. No bodies, no clues, just trails of blood leading into the murky water. I couldn't get the image out of my head. What kind of creature could drag 2 grown men out of their boat? More people started reporting strange noises at night, sounds that didn't belong in our swamp. Not the usual splashes of fish or grunts of gators, but something different, like a deep rumbling mixed with a hiss. Some folks said it sounded like a giant snake. Others said it was more like a crocodile, but bigger than anything they'd ever heard. I started carrying my rifle with me everywhere. The other rangers thought I was being paranoid, but they hadn't seen what I'd seen. They hadn't noticed how the birds had stopped singing near the creek, or how even the alligators, the kings of our swamp, had moved away from that area. One evening, while checking some water samples, I saw it, just a glimpse. But it was enough to make my blood run cold. Something massive moved under my boat, something that made a 12-foot alligator look like a baby lizard. Through the dark water, I could make out a shape that seemed to go on forever. Its skin looked rough and bumpy, almost glowing with that same blue light I'd seen before. As I sat there, frozen, a horrible thought hit me. What if the mining company hadn't just left behind toxic waste? What if they'd found something down there? Something that had been sleeping all these years until their chemicals woke it up? I knew I had to end this. More people would die if I didn't. After looking through more old mining records, I found something that made sense. They'd been digging for copper, but they'd also found weird rocks that gave off radiation. They'd sealed off the mine shaft. But 30 years of rain and erosion must have broken the seal. I loaded my boat with everything I could think of. My rifle, some dynamite from our supply shed, we used it to clear fallen trees, and a bunch of floodlights. I waited until sunset, when the creature seemed most active. The air felt heavy that evening, like right before a big storm. That's when I saw it rise from the water. I wish I could say my memory of it is fuzzy, but I remember every detail. It was like a giant salamander, but wrong in every way. It must have been 30 feet long, with patchy, glowing blue skin that looked like it was rotting in some places. Its head was massive, with rows of teeth that glowed like the rest of it. But its eyes, they looked almost human, and that was the worst part. It came at my boat fast. I managed to get the floodlights on, and that seemed to hurt it. It screamed in a way that made my ears ring. I fired my rifle, but the bullets just bounced off its thick skin. That's when I knew what I had to do. I started my boat's motor and headed straight for the old mine entrance. The creature followed me, just like I hoped it would. I could feel it right behind me, its massive body making waves that almost flipped my boat. When I got to the mine entrance, I threw the dynamite, all of it, right into the crack where the toxic waste was seeping out. The creature lunged at me right as I shot the dynamite. The explosion was huge. The last thing I remember was the heat, and the creature's scream, and then the water rushing in as the whole bank collapsed. They found me 2 days later, washed up on a sandbar. The doctors say I got too much of whatever toxic stuff was in that water. They don't think I have much time left. But I did what I had to do. The swamp is safe now. The creature died in that explosion. They found pieces of it scattered all over the creek. Sometimes, on quiet nights in my hospital room, I think I can still hear that deep rumbling sound. And I wonder, was it really the only one of its kind? My name is William Cooper, and this happened to me back in 1985 when I was working as a park ranger at Denali National Park in Alaska. Even now, almost 40 years later, my hands still ache where my fingers used to be, especially when it snows. But I need to tell this story. People deserve to know what's out there in those mountains. I was 32 back then, young and confident, with 8 years of ranger experience under my belt. Denali was my dream posting. I loved the wild beauty of Alaska, the endless mountains, and even the brutal winters. My job was to keep people safe in one of the most dangerous places on Earth, and I was good at it, really good at it. Until that night. It was February 12th, the middle of what we were calling the worst winter in decades. The wind was howling like a wounded animal, and the temperature had dropped to -40. No sane person would be out in weather like that. I was in my cabin, going through some paperwork when the distress signal came in. At first, it was just static and broken words coming through my radio. Help, Station 4. Something. God, please. The voice was terrified, and it was coming from the research station about 5 miles up in the mountains. They were studying weather patterns up there, 3 scientists who should have been fine until spring. I still remember sitting there, staring at my radio, while my coffee got cold. Every bit of training, every bit of experience I had was screaming at me not to go out in that blizzard. In weather like that, you're supposed to wait it out. But something in that broken voice made my blood run cold. It wasn't just fear I heard, it was pure terror. I grabbed my emergency pack, put on my heaviest winter gear, and radioed back to base what I was doing. They told me I was crazy, that no one could make it up there in this weather. Maybe I should have listened. But I didn't know then what I know now. I didn't know that some calls for help should go unanswered. Getting to the research station usually took me about 2 hours on a normal day. But this was different. The moment I stepped outside, I knew something was wrong. The snow wasn't falling normally. It was swirling in ways I'd never seen before, like it was alive somehow. My flashlight beam couldn't cut through more than a few feet ahead of me. I checked my compass to get my bearings, and that's when I got my first real scare. The needle was spinning wildly, like a broken clock. I'd been using compasses for 20 years, and I'd never seen anything like it. But I knew these mountains well enough to find my way without one. At least, that's what I told myself. The wind kept getting stronger as I climbed higher. It was so cold that my breath froze instantly on my face mask. But there was something else, too, a feeling I couldn't shake off. You know that feeling when you think someone's watching you? It was like that, but worse. Much worse. About halfway there, I found the first tracks in the snow. They made no sense at all. They looked like footprints, but they went straight up vertical cliff faces. Some of them started and stopped in the middle of nowhere, like whatever made them had appeared out of thin air. I took pictures with my camera, though my hands were shaking so bad I wasn't sure they'd come out right. The temperature gauge on my watch showed minus 60 degrees now. Colder than I'd ever seen it. Colder than it should be possible up here. The batteries in my flashlight were dying much faster than they should, and my radio was picking up nothing but static and strange whisper-like sounds. Then I saw it. Something that still haunts my dreams. A set of tracks that seemed to be following me, appearing in the snow behind me as I walked. Fresh tracks showing up out of nowhere. I spun around, but there was nothing there except swirling snow. That's when I heard it, a sound like laughter carried on the wind, but not human laughter. Not human at all. The research station was just ahead now, a dark shape in the whiteness. No lights were on, which was wrong. They had backup generators. There should have been lights. As I got closer, I saw that the main door was wide open, swinging in the wind. Snow had blown inside, covering everything in white. I stood there, staring at that open door. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around and run. But those scientists were in there somewhere, maybe hurt, maybe worse. I had a job to do, so I took a deep breath, turned up my failing flashlight, and stepped inside. I didn't know it then, but I was walking into a nightmare that would change my life forever. The moment I stepped inside, my flashlight caught something that made my heart stop. Bloody handprints on the wall. They were smeared, like someone had been dragging themselves along. The snow that had blown in was stained pink in places. "Hello?" I called out. The only answer was the howling wind. My voice sounded small in the darkness. The station wasn't very big, just a main room with some weather equipment, a small kitchen, and 3 bedrooms. But something felt off about the space, like the corners of the rooms were somehow wrong, like the walls weren't quite where they should be. I found their research log on a desk, papers scattered everywhere. The last entry was from just 2 days ago. It read, "Temperature readings impossible. Equipment must be broken. Jim saw something in the storm. Says it has a face. We're leaving tomorrow if weather permits. If anyone finds this, do not trust the snow." The kitchen was a mess. Chairs were knocked over, and there was a half-eaten meal still on the table, like they'd run away in the middle of dinner. One of the bedroom doors was locked. When I finally got it open, I found all their winter gear still there. All 3 sets of coats, boots, and gloves. Whatever had happened, they hadn't gone outside properly dressed. In this weather, that was suicide. Then the temperature dropped even more. I could see my breath coming out in thick clouds now, and frost was forming on the inside of my goggles. The thermometer on the wall read minus 80 degrees, a temperature that's not possible on Earth. As I watched, the red line kept dropping lower and lower. That's when I heard it, a sound from the main room. Like footsteps, but not quite right. They were too light, like someone dancing on the snow, and they were getting closer. I turned around slowly, my flashlight beam shaking. The beam caught something moving in the doorway, something white and shifting, like part of the blizzard had come inside. But blizzards don't have shapes. Blizzards don't have eyes. This one did. Through the swirling snow I saw them, 2 glowing blue eyes, floating in a face made of ice and wind. The thing in the doorway was roughly human-shaped, but it moved like smoke, its edges constantly shifting and swirling, and it was looking right at me. My flashlight flickered once, twice, and then went dead, leaving me alone in the darkness with whatever had come to find me. I ran. There wasn't any time to think. My body just moved on its own. I could hear it coming behind me. The sound, like winter itself, was breathing down my neck. The air got so cold it burned my lungs with every breath. The thing, this living blizzard, followed me through the station. Where it passed, everything froze solid. Windows cracked, metal pipes burst, and the walls creaked like they were about to break. I knew if it touched me, I'd freeze just like everything else. I made it to the back room and slammed the door shut, but it didn't matter. The creature just came right through it, like the door wasn't even there. In the dim light coming through the window, I could see it better now. It looked like someone had taken a piece of the storm and given it a shape. Snow and ice swirled around where its body should be, and those bright blue eyes stared at me without blinking. "What did you do to them?" I shouted, backing away. "Where are the scientists?" It didn't speak, not really. But the wind changed, and in it I heard screaming, distant screams that sounded like the researchers. The creature reached for me with an arm made of swirling snow. The temperature dropped so low that the metal doorknob behind me shattered when I touched it. I had nowhere left to run. The thing had me cornered. That's when I remembered the flare gun in my pack. With shaking hands, I pulled it out and fired straight at the creature's face. The red flare went right through it, but for a second, the heat made the thing pull back. It screeched, a sound like ice cracking mixed with wind howling, and part of it melted away. That's when I understood. It wasn't just made of snow and ice, it was snow and ice. And like all ice, it could melt. I had 3 flares left, 3 chances to get out alive. The creature came at me again, but this time I was ready. But as I ran by, one of its ice-cold arms caught my hand. The pain was worse than anything I'd ever felt, like my fingers were being dipped in liquid nitrogen. I screamed but kept running. I had to get out, had to get away. Behind me I could hear it coming, could feel the air getting colder and colder as it chased me through the station. The front door was just ahead, still swinging open in the wind. But now I knew the storm outside wasn't just a storm. It was more of them, maybe hundreds more, and I had to run right through them to have any chance of survival. I looked down at my hand where the creature had grabbed me. My fingers were pure white and completely numb, but I couldn't think about that now. I had 2 flares left, and about 5 miles of mountain between me and safety. I tucked my frozen hand into my coat and got ready to run. The moment I stepped outside, I saw them. Dozens of glowing blue eyes in the storm, watching me. The blizzard itself was alive, full of these things. They were everywhere, swirling around me like a frozen tornado. The original creature emerged from the station behind me, its icy form growing larger, feeding off the storm. I fired my second-to-last flare into the thickest part of the storm. The shapes scattered like startled birds, leaving me a path. I ran as fast as I could through the snow, trying to remember the way down the mountain. The wind was so strong now it nearly knocked me over, and the cold was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. They followed me. Of course they did. I could hear them moving through the storm, their whispers carried on the wind. My ears and nose were freezing, and my injured hand felt like it was made of glass. But I kept running. When I got to the steepest part of the trail, I slipped. My last flare fell out of my pocket and rolled away into the darkness. The storm creatures moved closer, their blue eyes glowing brighter. I could feel them pulling the heat from my body. My eyelashes were freezing shut, and my thoughts were getting slow and foggy, the first signs of freezing to death. That's when I remembered something from my survival training: body heat. These things wanted cold, needed it. So I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled off my glove with my teeth and pressed my good hand against my frozen one, trying to warm it up. The pain was horrible, like thousands of needles stabbing me at once. The creatures didn't like that. They backed away a little, confused by the heat I was making. I kept going, stomping my feet, moving my arms, doing anything I could to keep my blood flowing. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them from getting too close. I walked like that for what felt like hours, fighting through the pain and cold, keeping my body temperature up just enough to hold them back. By the time I saw the lights of my cabin, I could barely walk. The storm creatures had fallen behind, staying up on their mountain where the air was colder. I made it inside and passed out. The rescue team found me the next morning. The doctors couldn't save my fingers. All 10 of them had to be removed due to severe frostbite. They never found the scientists. The official report said they must have got lost in the storm and died from exposure. But I know what really happened to them. Sometimes, on very cold nights, I can still hear their screams in the wind. And when the weather forecast predicts a blizzard, I make sure I'm far away from any mountains. Because now I know the truth. Not every storm is just a storm. And up there in Denali, in the deepest part of winter, something is waiting in the white darkness, watching with eyes like blue fire, hungry for warmth and life. These days I have prosthetic fingers. They work pretty well, except when the temperature drops. Then they get cold, colder than they should. And sometimes, I swear I can see frost forming on them, even when I'm inside by the fire. My name is James Mitchell, and this happened to me back in 1997 when I was working as a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. I still think about it every day, trying to make sense of what happened during those strange, foggy days that changed my life forever. I was 32 then, had been a ranger for about 6 years, and I loved every minute of it. Well, almost every minute. The long hikes, helping lost tourists, watching the bears from a safe distance. It was the perfect job for someone like me who preferred trees to office cubicles. I lived alone in a small cabin near the ranger station, and my German Shepherd Max was all the company I needed. That October was different, though. The weather had been acting weird for weeks. The fog that usually came and went in the morning started staying all day, getting thicker and thicker until you could barely see 10 feet ahead. At first, we thought it was just a strange weather pattern, but looking back, I should have known something wasn't right when Max started refusing to go on patrols with me. He'd just sit at the cabin door, whining, his ears flat against his head. I remembered checking the weather station's data over and over, trying to understand what was causing this unusual fog. The readings made no sense. Sometimes showing temperatures from the 1940s, other times showing impossible numbers that couldn't be right. But that was just the beginning of the strange things that were about to happen in my mountains. It started with a young couple who came running into my station one rainy afternoon. Their faces were pale, and the woman was crying. Between sobs, she told me something that made my skin crawl. She had seen her grandmother walking through the fog, clear as day, smiling and waving at her. The thing is, her grandmother had died 3 years ago. I tried to calm them down, telling them it was probably just their minds playing tricks on them. The fog can do that, I said, make you see things that aren't really there. But deep down, something felt wrong. Over the next few days, more hikers came in with similar stories. An old man saw his brother who had died in Vietnam. A little girl saw her mom's best friend who had passed away last summer. Each story made less and less sense. Then it happened to me. I was doing my evening patrol. walking along Trail Ridge, with my flashlight cutting through the thick fog. The radio on my belt kept crackling with static, which wasn't unusual in the mountains. But then I heard voices through the static, old-timey voices talking about rationing during World War II. I switched channels, but the voices followed. They were talking about things that happened over 50 years ago, as if they were happening right now. I checked my watch. 6:30 p.m. I walked for what felt like 5 minutes, then checked again. 4:45 p.m. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. Time itself wasn't working right in these mountains anymore. Every step I took felt heavier than the last. The fog seemed to be alive somehow, swirling around me like it was trying to tell me something. I needed to figure out what was happening before things got worse. Little did I know, they were about to get much, much worse. The answers I was looking for came at midnight during one of my patrols. I was walking near Clingman's Dome, the highest point in the park, when my flashlight caught something strange in the fog. It wasn't a ghost this time. It was worse. The air itself seemed to be torn, like someone had taken a pair of scissors and cut right through it. Through this tear I could see something else. Another time, maybe, or another place. My radio went crazy. Instead of the usual park frequencies, I heard snippets of conversations from different times all mixed together. A woman talking about Pearl Harbor as if it just happened. A man announcing Kennedy's election. A child talking about their first day of school in 1955. All these voices, all these times, bleeding into our present through that tear in the air. But that wasn't the scariest part. As I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, something moved in that tear. Something big, something that shouldn't exist anymore. Through the rip, I saw shapes, moving creatures that looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. They were like shadows with teeth, ancient things that belonged to a time long before humans walked the earth, and they were trying to get through. I watched in horror as one of them pushed against the tear, making it bigger. The fog swirled faster around me, and the air got so cold my breath came out in white puffs. I knew right then that if these things got through, our world would be in serious danger. These weren't friendly ghosts or harmless time echoes. These were predators from Earth's ancient past, and they were hungry. I knew I had to do something fast. These creatures were getting closer to breaking through, and I was the only one who could stop them. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my radio, but who could I even call? Who would believe me if I told them ancient monsters were trying to crawl into our world through a hole in time? That's when I remembered something my grandfather, who was also a ranger, once told me. He said the mountains held old magic, that the Cherokee people who lived here long ago knew how to seal doorways to other worlds using the power of the land itself. I'd always thought they were just stories to entertain kids, but now I ran back to my cabin and grabbed my grandfather's old journal. There, scribbled in the margins of a page about local plants, was what looked like a ritual. It needed 3 things: water from the highest spring, earth from the deepest cave, and a personal sacrifice, something that meant everything to the person trying to seal the doorway. The spring water was easy. The cave dirt took longer, and I could hear those things getting closer, their shadows growing larger in the tear. But the sacrifice part, that's when I realized what it meant. The thing that meant most to me was my time as a ranger, protecting these mountains. If I used that, I might save everyone, but I'd be stuck here forever, watching over this tear, making sure it never opened again. I didn't have much time to think about it. Those creatures were halfway through now, their shapes becoming clearer, more horrible. Making my decision, I took out my ranger badge, the one thing that represented everything I loved about my life here. I stood at the edge of the tier, holding my ranger badge in one hand, and the mixture of spring water and cave dirt in the other. The creatures were so close now, I could smell them like burnt metal and old bones. One of them reached out with what looked like a claw made of shadows. It was now or never. I threw the mixture at the tier and held up my badge. The words came out of my mouth automatically, like someone else was speaking through me. Old Cherokee words I didn't understand but somehow knew. The badge in my hand started to get hot, then began to glow with a blue light that matched the fog around me. The tier started to shrink, and those things, they screamed. Not like any animal I'd ever heard, more like the sound of ice cracking on a frozen lake. They tried to push through faster, but the tier was closing. My badge was burning hot now, melting in my hand. But I couldn't let go. The world around me started spinning, time rushing past like a fast-forward movie. I saw days turn to nights in seconds. I saw seasons change in minutes. I watched as hikers passed by, not seeing me, while I stayed in the same spot, unable to move far from where the tier had been. I realized then what my sacrifice meant. I wasn't just giving up my job, I was giving up my place in time itself. And that's where I am now, still here, watching, making sure that tier never opens again. Time moves different for me now. Sometimes a whole year passes in what feels like a day to me. Sometimes a single minute stretches out for what feels like weeks. I see hikers come and go, but they can't see me anymore. I'm part of the fog now, part of the mountains themselves. If you ever visit the Great Smoky Mountains and see a strange fog rolling in, or hear old voices on your radio, or think you see a ranger watching you from between the trees, well, now you know who I am. I'm still here, still doing my job, protecting everyone from what lies on the other side of time. Some sacrifices are worth making, even if they last forever. The strangest part? Sometimes on really foggy days I see myself. Yes, you heard that right. I see another Ranger Mitchell, walking these same paths, discovering the tier for the first time. I try to warn him, but I can't. I watch as he makes the same choice I did, over and over again. It's like being stuck in a loop that never ends. Last week, or maybe it was last year, time is hard to keep track of now. I saw something that gave me hope. A young ranger was investigating the strange fog, just like I did. But this time, something was different. She had some kind of device I'd never seen before. Something that beeped when it got near where the tier used to be. Maybe someday, someone will figure out what really happened here. Maybe they'll even find a way to free me from this endless watch. Until then, I'll keep doing what I've always done, protecting these mountains and the people who visit them. If you ever hear about the Mist Stalker of the Great Smoky Mountains, or stories about a ranger who appears and disappears in the fog, just remember, I'm not a ghost story. I'm just a ranger who made a choice, the only choice I could make. And if you ever feel like time isn't quite right in these mountains or see something strange in the fog, just keep walking. Don't stop. Don't look back. I've got your back, just like I always have, and always will. My name is Thomas Reed, and this happened to me back in 1988 when I was working as a park ranger at Redwood National Park in California. Even now, 36 years later, my hands shake when I try to write about it. Most people say, I'm crazy, and maybe they're right. After all, who would believe a story about trees that bleed and forests that come alive? But everything I'm about to tell you is true. I was 32 then, and I loved my job more than anything. There's something special about walking among those giant redwoods. Some of them are over 1,000 years old. They were already ancient when Columbus sailed to America. Every morning I'd patrol the same trails, checking on the wildlife and making sure hikers were safe. The air always smelled like earth and pine needles, and the morning fog made everything look magical. But that summer, everything changed. It started when I got reports about illegal logging happening deep in the park. Now, we'd dealt with illegal logging before. Some people just can't resist the money they can make from these ancient trees. But this was different. The loggers had gone into a part of the forest that no one had touched in decades, a place where the trees grew so close together that they blocked out the sun, and the silence felt heavy, like it was hiding something. I remember the day I went to investigate. The morning was unusually cold for summer, and the fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. I had no idea I was about to discover something that would change my life forever, something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about nature, about reality itself. And maybe I should have left it alone. Maybe I should have turned back when I saw the first signs. But I didn't. And that's why I'm one of the only people left alive who knows the truth about what really happened in the Forest of the Dead. I still remember every detail of that first investigation. Following the sound of chainsaws, I hiked deeper into the forest than I usually went. The trees seemed different here, older, twisted in strange ways. Even the bird sounds faded away until all I could hear were my own footsteps on the damp ground and my heart beating in my chest. After about an hour of walking, I found the first signs of illegal cutting. There were fresh stumps, some still sticky with sap, and heavy tire tracks in the mud. But something wasn't right. The loggers had left their equipment behind, chainsaws and axes just lying there like they'd dropped them and run. And then I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. One of the freshly cut stumps was oozing liquid that looked exactly like blood. Not tree sap, which is usually clear or slightly yellow. This was deep red and thick. At first, I thought someone must have hurt themselves with a chainsaw, but when I got closer, I could see the red liquid was coming from inside the tree itself, pulsing out like a beating heart. I've been around trees my whole life, but I'd never seen anything like this. My hands were shaking as I took pictures with my work camera. I reached out to touch the red liquid, then pulled my hand back. Something in my gut told me not to. That's when I heard voices coming through the trees. A group of loggers was heading back to their site, probably returning from lunch. I quickly hid behind a massive redwood and listened. There were 4 of them, and they sounded scared. "I'm telling you, Mike, this ain't right," one of them said. "First Joe disappears, and now this? These trees ain't normal." "Shut up," another voice snapped. "We're getting paid good money for this job. Just don't think about it." But I could hear the fear in their voices. They knew something was wrong too. As I watched them pick up their tools, one of them suddenly stopped and pointed at something on the ground. In the growing darkness between the trees, I could see what looked like old stone carvings, partly buried in the earth. The loggers had uncovered something that had been hidden for a very long time. I should have reported everything I saw right away, should have called for backup. But something made me wait. I needed to know more. So I stayed hidden and watched as the men started their chainsaws again, their faces pale with fear. None of us knew then that we were about to uncover something that should have stayed buried forever. The next morning, I came back with two other rangers, John and Mike. I had to show someone else what I'd seen. But when we got there, the bloody tree stump was just normal. No red liquid, no pulsing, nothing strange at all. John and Mike looked at me like I was losing my mind. Maybe I was, but then we found something worse. As we searched the area, we discovered what the loggers had uncovered the day before. It was an old Native American burial ground, with stone markers and artifacts scattered everywhere. The loggers' machines had torn up the earth, exposing things that had been buried for hundreds of years. I felt sick to my stomach just looking at it. That's when the radio crackled. One of the logging crew members, Bill Thompson, had gone missing. They found his chainsaw next to a half-cut tree, still running, but no sign of Bill. The search began right away, but none of us was prepared for what we found 3 days later. We discovered Bill's body at sunrise. He was positioned in one of the tallest redwoods, about 50 feet up. It looked like someone had carefully placed him there, sitting on a branch like he was just taking a break. But that was impossible. Nobody could have lifted him up there without heavy equipment. And there were no marks on the tree. The police came, but they couldn't figure it out either. They said maybe Bill had climbed up there himself and had an accident. But I knew better. I'd seen his face. He looked terrified, like he'd seen something impossible before he died. More strange things started happening after that. Tools would go missing, only to show up in the treetops. Workers reported hearing whispers when nobody was around. And the trees, more of them started bleeding whenever the loggers tried to cut them down. Dark red drops falling like rain. One night I stayed late to keep watch. The moon was full, casting weird shadows through the branches. That's when I saw something that still haunts my dreams. The trees moved, not like normal trees swaying in the wind. They moved like they were breathing. The branches reached down toward the ground like fingers, and in the darkness between them, I saw shapes that looked like people, but they weren't solid. They floated like smoke, wearing clothes that seemed hundreds of years old. I tried to tell my boss we needed to stop all logging in the area, that we were disturbing something ancient and angry. But when I mentioned the moving trees and the spirits, he just smiled, that sad smile people give to someone they think has lost their mind. If only they had listened to me then, maybe it would have saved their lives. A week after we found Bill, the logging company sent in a bigger crew. They didn't care about the bleeding trees or the missing people. They just wanted their timber. That's when everything went terribly wrong. I was there that night, trying one last time to convince them to stop. There were 12 men with heavy machinery, ready to cut down the oldest trees in that cursed part of the forest. The sun was setting, and a cold wind blew through the trees, making a sound like sad whispers. "Please," I begged them. "You don't understand what you're dealing with here." But they just laughed and started up their machines. The first chainsaw bit into an ancient redwood, and that's when it happened. The sound that came from that tree wasn't the normal creaking of wood. It was a scream. A real human scream that made everyone freeze. Then the ground started shaking. At first we thought it was an earthquake, but it wasn't. The trees were moving, not just swaying, but actually pulling their roots out of the ground. Giant redwoods that had stood still for 1,000 years were walking. Their branches reached down like huge arms, grabbing at the loggers who were now running in panic. I saw dark shapes floating between the trees. The spirits of the Native Americans whose rest we had disturbed. They moved like smoke in the wind, passing through people who instantly fell to the ground, their faces frozen in terror. "Run!" I shouted, but it was too late for most of them. The trees had surrounded us. Roots burst from the ground, wrapping around legs and pulling people down. Branches swooped like giant hands, lifting screaming men into the air. I saw one logger being passed from tree to tree, getting higher and higher until he disappeared into the darkness above. I ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. Branches whipped at my face, roots tried to trip me, and all around me I could hear the screams of the men being taken by the forest. Something grabbed my jacket. A branch, or maybe a spirit's hand, but I yanked free and kept running. Behind me, I heard a sound like thunder, but it was the ancient redwoods moving together, their roots tearing up the earth, their branches weaving together to form a wall that sealed off that part of the forest forever. When I finally made it back to the ranger station, I was covered in dirt and scratches, and my hair had turned completely white. Of the 13 people in the forest that night, I was the only one who made it out. They never found the bodies of the logging crew. The machines, the tools, everything was gone, like the forest had swallowed them whole. The police investigated for months, but they never figured out what really happened. They came up with all sorts of explanations. The loggers must have gotten lost, or there was some kind of accident. Nobody believed my story about moving trees and angry spirits. Eventually, they just marked it as an unsolved case. I didn't speak for almost a year after that night. How could I? The doctors said I was in shock, but the truth is, I just couldn't find the words to describe what I'd seen. Even now, 36 years later, I sometimes wake up at night, thinking I can hear the sound of trees walking. I quit my job as a ranger soon after. Couldn't stand to be in the forest anymore. They say it's for environmental protection. But I know the real reason. Sometimes hikers who get too close to that area say they hear strange whispers in the wind, and some swear they've seen trees move when they shouldn't. You might wonder why I'm finally telling this story now. Last week, I read in the newspaper that another logging company is planning to cut trees in a different part of the park. They say they have all the right permits, that it's all legal this time. But I had to warn them. Some places should be left alone. Some things are sacred. I still drive past the park sometimes early in the morning when the fog rolls in. Through the mist, I can see those ancient redwoods standing tall and quiet. They look normal now, peaceful even. But I know their secret. I know what they can do if we push them too far. So if you're ever hiking in Redwood National Park, and you come across a part of the forest where the trees grow too close together, where the birds don't sing and the silence feels heavy, turn around, walk away, because the forest remembers, and the spirits of the dead are still there, watching, waiting in the shadows of those ancient trees. I'm one of the only people alive who knows the truth about what happened in the forest of the dead. Now you know too. Please help me make sure nobody disturbs that place again. Some secrets should stay buried, and some trees should be left standing. My name is Kevin Martinez, and this happened to me back in 1992 when I was working as a ranger in Death Valley, California. I was 32 years old then, and I loved my job more than anything. Every morning I'd wake up before sunrise, put on my khaki uniform, and head out to patrol one of the hottest places on Earth. There was something magical about watching the sun rise over those endless stretches of sand and rock. That year started like any other, me doing my usual rounds, helping lost tourists, and making sure nobody got themselves into trouble in the brutal desert heat. I was good at my job, really good. I knew every trail, every landmark, and I thought I knew all of Death Valley's secrets. Boy, was I wrong. It all began on a surprisingly cool October morning. I remember it clearly because the air had that crisp feel you only get in the desert during fall. I was checking out a report from some hikers who said they'd spotted something unusual near the base of one of our less visited canyons. They weren't sure what it was. Maybe a new cave opening, they said. Something about recent tremors might have exposed it. I didn't think much of it at first. Death Valley has hundreds of small caves, and most of them aren't anything special. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the way the morning shadows played across the canyon walls, or maybe it was just my gut feeling. But as I approached the spot the hikers had marked on their map, I felt a chill run down my spine. That was the morning I found the cave system that would change my life forever. Looking back now, I wish I had just walked away. But how could I have known? How could anyone have known what was sleeping beneath the desert floor, waiting to wake up? The entrance to the cave wasn't very big, just wide enough for me to squeeze through with my backpack. I switched on my flashlight and took that first step inside. The air felt different in there, cooler than it should be, and there was this strange smell I couldn't quite place, like wet earth, which was weird since Death Valley barely gets any rain. As I moved deeper inside, my flashlight beam showed me something that made me stop in my tracks. The walls weren't just plain rock, they were covered in paintings. Old ones, really old ones. They weren't like the usual Native American art we sometimes find in the area. These were different, drawn in deep red colors that almost seemed to glow when my light hit them. I'm no expert in cave paintings, but I've seen enough of them in my years as a ranger. These were strange. They showed figures, lots of them, all running away from something, and below them there was this massive shape, something that looked like a giant worm or snake, but bigger than anything I'd ever heard of. That's when I felt it, a tiny tremor under my feet. Just a little shake, like when a big truck drives by. But we weren't anywhere near a road. I checked my watch, 10:47 a.m. I decided to mark the time, just in case. Something in my gut told me it might be important. I went a bit further in, taking photos with my camera. The tunnel split into two paths, and the air coming from the left one felt wrong. It was warm and had this pulse to it, like breathing. I've been in hundreds of caves, but I'd never felt anything like this. Then it happened again, another tremor. I checked my watch, 11:47 a.m., exactly 1 hour after the first one. That's when I knew this wasn't just some random cave. I needed to get back to the ranger station and report this. But before I left, I took one last look at those paintings. The people who drew them were trying to tell us something. A warning, maybe? Looking at those red figures running away from that massive shape below them, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were trying to warn us about something. Something that was still down there. Over the next few days, things started getting weird, really weird. First, I noticed the coyotes were acting strange. Usually they only come out at night, but now they were running around in broad daylight, heading away from the cave area like something was chasing them. Even the lizards and snakes, I saw them all moving in the same direction, away from that part of the valley. I kept going back to the cave, taking notes about the tremors. They were like clockwork, every hour on the hour, and they were getting stronger. What started as tiny shakes was now making small rocks fall from the cave ceiling. I tried telling my boss about it, but he just laughed it off. "It's probably just some underground water movement," he said, but I knew better. Water doesn't move like clockwork, and it definitely doesn't make desert animals run away in fear. Then came the sounds. At first they were so low you could barely hear them, like the humming of power lines, but deeper. But they kept getting louder. Standing at the cave entrance, I could feel it in my chest, like a giant heartbeat coming from deep underground. One morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. Near the cave entrance, there was this crack in the ground that wasn't there before. It was oozing this thick, dark liquid that smelled like rotten eggs. I took a sample in a jar, and when I checked it later that night with my flashlight, I swear I saw it move on its own. The tremors were now strong enough to shake my coffee cup right off my desk at the ranger station. But the really scary part? The wildlife was completely gone. No birds, no lizards, not even insects. It was like every living thing knew something bad was about to happen. I tried calling some scientists I knew, but nobody would take me seriously. Death Valley has small earthquakes all the time, they said. But these weren't normal earthquakes. The animals knew it. I knew it. And those ancient cave paintings, they knew it too. Then came the night that changed everything. It was just past midnight when the biggest tremor yet hit. I was in my ranger cabin, trying to make sense of all my notes, when my whole room started shaking. Books fell off shelves, pictures crashed to the floor, and that deep humming sound I'd been hearing, it turned into something like a roar. I grabbed my flashlight and emergency kit and raced to my truck. As I drove toward the cave, I could see parts of the desert floor cracking open like somebody was breaking a giant piece of chocolate. The moon was full that night, which let me see something that still gives me nightmares. The ground around the cave was moving, not just shaking, but actually moving up and down, like something huge was breathing underneath. And that dark liquid I'd found earlier, it was now gushing out of every crack in the ground, forming these thick black pools that seemed to pulse with their own life. Then I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A massive shape pushed up through the desert floor, sending rocks and sand flying everywhere. It was like those cave paintings had come to life, but 100 times worse. This thing was huge, bigger than a train, and it had this skin that looked like wet leather mixed with metal. Its body was segmented, like a giant worm, but covered in these sharp, bony plates. The creature lifted what I guess was its head, and I saw rows of teeth that glowed with a sickly green light. When it opened its mouth, the sound that came out shook the whole valley. My truck's windows cracked from the noise alone. I knew right then that if this thing got loose, it wouldn't stop at Death Valley. There were towns nearby, cities not too far away. How many people would die if this ancient monster got free? That's when I realized what I had to do. Sometimes in life, you have just one chance to do the right thing. As I sat in my truck, watching this nightmare creature rise from the ground, I knew this was my moment. I had about 50 pounds of explosives in the ranger station's emergency bunker. We kept them for controlled rock slides and emergency cave-ins. I also knew that the cave system had a weak point, right where the two main tunnels met. See, during my investigations, I'd mapped out the whole place, marking the spots where the rock looked most fragile. My hands were shaking as I loaded the explosives into my backpack. The creature was now halfway out of the ground, its massive body still emerging like some endless nightmare. Every movement it made caused another earthquake. I could hear rocks tumbling down the valley walls. I had to time this perfectly. The beast was still connected to its hole, still pulling itself out. If I could just get to the right spot in the cave and set off the explosives, maybe, just maybe, I could bring the whole thing down on top of it, trap it back underground where it came from. The hard part wasn't carrying the explosives through the shaking tunnel. It wasn't even setting them up while rocks fell all around me. The hard part was knowing I probably wouldn't make it out. There wouldn't be enough time to set the timer and run. I'd have to trigger it manually. I thought about my family, Mom, Dad, my sister in Colorado. I thought about all the people in the nearby towns who'd never know how close they came to this. I thought about those ancient artists who painted their warnings on the cave walls, trying to tell us what lived below. As I set up the last charge, I could hear the creature getting closer to the cave entrance. Its roar was so loud now that small rocks were falling from the ceiling. I took one last look at my watch, the same watch I'd used to time those first tremors. Took a deep breath, said a quick prayer. I hit the detonator just as I saw those glowing green teeth appear at the cave entrance. The explosion was deafening, like 100 thunderclaps all at once. The whole mountain seemed to come down around me. I ran deeper into the cave, away from the creature, as rocks crashed down everywhere. The beast let out this horrible scream. Imagine the loudest thunder you've ever heard, mixed with the screech of 1,000 eagles. The sound was so powerful it knocked me off my feet. I could feel the cave collapsing behind me, and then something hit my head. Everything went black. I still don't know how I survived. When I woke up, I was in a small pocket of air, surrounded by fallen rocks. My flashlight was somehow still working, and I had just enough room to wiggle through a tiny gap between the rocks. It took me 6 hours to crawl out through spaces barely big enough for my body. When I finally made it outside, the sun was rising over Death Valley. Where the cave entrance had been, there was now just a massive pile of fallen rock. The ground had stopped shaking. The horrible roaring was gone. The dark liquid had disappeared too, like it had never been there. Nobody ever believed my story, of course. The official report says it was just a series of earthquakes that caused a natural cave-in. They found the cave paintings, but the scientists said they were probably just ancient hunting scenes. The missing wildlife? They said it was just normal migration. But I know what I saw. Sometimes at night, I still hear that deep humming in my dreams. And every now and then, when I read about mysterious tremors in desert areas around the world, I wonder if maybe there are more of those things down there, sleeping, waiting. I still work as a ranger, but not in Death Valley anymore. I transferred to a small park in Montana. The tourists here sometimes ask me why I left such a famous park for this quiet place. I just smile and tell them I prefer the mountains to the desert. But every year, on the anniversary of that night, I check the news from Death Valley. So far, everything's been quiet. I pray it stays that way, because sometimes the things that sleep beneath the earth should stay asleep. And sometimes the warnings left by ancient people aren't just stories. They're trying to tell us something important, something we really, really need to hear. My name is Paul Anderson, and this happened to me back in 1995 when I was working as a ranger at Yellowstone National Park. I still get chills thinking about it, even after all these years. You know how some memories just stick with you? Well, this one's burned into my mind like a brand. I was 32 then, had been a ranger for almost 8 years, and thought I'd seen everything there was to see in those woods. Bears, wolves, angry moose, you name it. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I encountered that autumn. It all started in early October. The leaves were turning golden, tourists were getting fewer, and the air had that crisp bite to it that meant winter wasn't far off. I was doing my usual rounds, checking on campsites and making sure everything was in order, when I started noticing something odd. The animals were acting strange, and I don't mean just a little different. I mean really strange. I remember this one morning particularly well. I was walking near Old Faithful, and there was this herd of elk, usually pretty calm creatures, but they were huddled together, shaking like they'd seen something that scared them half to death. When I got closer, they bolted, not just ran, but practically trampled each other trying to get away. At first, I brushed it off. Animals can be weird sometimes, and we were heading into winter. But then more reports started coming in. Other rangers were seeing the same thing, deer abandoning their usual grazing spots, bears leaving areas full of food. Even the birds seemed to be clearing out faster than usual for the season. But what really got my attention were the claw marks we found. Those claw marks. They weren't like anything I'd ever seen before. One morning, I was checking out a report of disturbed wildlife near Canyon Village when I found them. Deep scratches in the tree bark, about 15 feet up. Now, I'd seen plenty of bear marks in my time, but these were different. They were wider, deeper, and way too high up for any normal bear to reach. I took pictures and measurements, but something about those marks made my skin crawl. It was like looking at a puzzle where all the pieces were familiar, but the picture they made was all wrong. I called in my friend Mike from the biology department, and even he was stumped. Things got worse over the next few days. More marks started showing up on trees all over the park, and then we started finding other things. Dead animals that didn't look like they'd been killed by any normal predator. They weren't eaten, just broken, like something had played with them and left them there. That's when my boss decided we needed to put together a search team. There were 5 of us, me, Mike from biology, Sarah, who was our best tracker, and 2 other experienced rangers, Tom and Dave. We all knew the park like the back of our hands. But somehow, that didn't make me feel any better. The day we headed out, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds. The wind was making weird noises through the trees, and I couldn't shake this feeling that we were being watched. You know that feeling when you're alone in the dark, and you're sure there's something behind you? It was like that, but in broad daylight. We had our rifles, tranq guns, and all the usual gear. But as we walked deeper into the park, following a trail of those strange marks and disturbed areas, I started to wonder if any of our equipment would be enough for what we might find. That's when we saw the shadows. These shadows. They didn't move like normal shadows should. It was late afternoon, and we were checking out an area where campers had reported strange noises. The sun was getting low, making everything look longer and darker. When Sarah noticed it first. "Paul," she whispered, grabbing my arm. Look at that shadow by the trees." We all stopped and watched. The shadow was moving against the wind, like something big was walking between the trees, but we couldn't see what was casting it. Tom raised his rifle, but I motioned him to keep it down. Whatever this thing was, I didn't want to startle it. Then we heard the first scream. It was Dave. He had walked a few steps ahead of us, and suddenly something yanked him upward so fast we barely had time to react. 1 second he was there, the next gone. Just the sound of branches breaking above us, and his scream echoing through the trees. "Dave!" Tom shouted, shining his flashlight up into the canopy. But all we could see were swaying branches and something that looked like. Was that a web? But it was huge. Bigger than any spider web I'd ever seen. We clustered together, backs to each other, weapons ready. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just our heavy breathing and the pounding of my heart in my ears. "We need to get out of here," Mike whispered. "Whatever this is," he never finished that sentence. Something dark and fast moved overhead, and Mike was gone too. Just gone. Sarah screamed, and Tom started firing his rifle into the trees, but it was like shooting at shadows. I grabbed Sarah's arm. "Run!" I yelled. We ran, but the shadows seemed to be everywhere now, moving between the trees, always just at the corner of our eyes. And that's when I saw it, really saw it. For the first time, it was like a spider, but all wrong. Imagine a spider the size of a car, but its legs were longer, more like tree branches than spider legs. Its body was dark, almost black, and it moved in a way that made my stomach turn. Not like a normal spider that scuttles. This thing moved like it was. Intelligent. Tom saw it too. He pushed Sarah behind him and started shooting, but the bullets seemed to just bounce off its body. The thing moved so fast, one of its legs swept out and caught Tom in the chest. I heard bones crack, and then he was gone, pulled into the darkness between the trees. Sarah was screaming and crying next to me. I grabbed her hand and we ran faster than I've ever run in my life. The creature was following us. I could hear it moving through the trees above us, breaking branches as it went. That sound, that horrible scratching sound of its legs on bark, I'll never forget it. We were almost back to the clearing where we'd left our trucks when Sarah tripped. I turned to help her up, but then I saw those long, dark legs reaching down from above. Sarah looked up, her eyes wide with terror. "Paul, help me," she cried out. I lunged for her hand, but I was too late. The thing pulled her up so fast she was just gone, just like the others. I was alone now. My whole team was gone, and this thing was still hunting me. I could hear it moving above me, those legs scraping against the trees. I had my rifle, but bullets didn't work. I needed something else. Something. Then I remembered the flare gun in my belt. Would you like me to continue with how I faced off against this monster? My hands were shaking as I pulled out the flare gun. I only had 2 flares, 2 chances to make this work. Above me, I could hear the creature moving, its legs making that awful scratching sound against the tree bark. I backed up against a large tree, trying to control my breathing. The monster was right above me now. I could see its dark shape blocking out the bits of sky between the branches. Sticky strands of web were dropping down around me, like it was trying to trap me. That's when I had an idea. If bullets couldn't hurt it, maybe fire could. I waited until I saw those long legs reaching down for me, just like they had for Sarah. My heart was beating so hard I thought it might burst. Then I aimed the flare gun straight up and pulled the trigger. The red light exploded above me, and for the first time, I heard the creature make a sound, a horrible shriek that made my ears hurt. The flare had hit it right in what looked like its face, and its whole body burst into flames. It thrashed around in the trees, its burning legs swinging wildly. One of them caught me in the shoulder, throwing me to the ground. The pain was terrible, but I forced myself to move. The creature was falling, bringing down branches and burning webs with it. I rolled away just as its massive body crashed to the ground. It was still moving, still trying to get to me, even while on fire. I pulled out my second flare, aimed right at what looked like its mouth, and fired. The monster exploded. I mean, really exploded. The blast knocked me backward, and I hit my head on a tree. Everything went black for a minute. When I came to, the creature was just burning. The smell was awful, like burning plastic mixed with rotten meat. The next few hours were like a bad dream. I radioed for help, and soon the park was crawling with rangers, police, and people in dark suits who didn't tell me who they were. They asked me lots of questions, over and over, like they were trying to catch me in a lie. But they couldn't ignore what was right in front of them, the huge, burned remains of whatever that thing was. They took it away in a special truck, covered with tarps. I never saw it again, and no one ever told me what it really was. We searched for days, hoping to find Dave, Mike, Sarah, or Tom. All we found were some torn pieces of clothing and those strange webs high up in the trees. Their families were told it was a bear attack. I wanted to tell them the truth, but who would believe me? I still work as a ranger, but not at Yellowstone. I couldn't stay there after what happened. Sometimes on dark nights when the wind moves through the trees, I think about my friends and that thing that took them. I think about those claw marks, 15 feet up the trees, and I wonder, are there more of them out there? You know what's really strange? A few weeks after it happened, all the reports about the incident disappeared from the park records. When people ask about that autumn in '95, they're told there was just some unusual bear activity. Nothing more. But I know what I saw. And sometimes when I'm in the woods and I hear branches moving above me, I look up. I always keep a flare gun with me now. Always. Because if there are more of those things out there, someone needs to know how to fight them. My name is Christopher Wells, and this happened to me back in 1999 when I was working as a park ranger at the Grand Canyon. What I'm about to tell you changed my life forever, and even now, as I write this from Pine Grove Mental Health Center, I sometimes wonder if anyone will ever believe my story. I was 32 years old then, with 6 years of experience as a ranger under my belt. I loved my job, helping tourists, protecting the wildlife, and spending my days surrounded by one of nature's most incredible wonders. The canyon walls were like old friends to me, and I knew every trail and lookout point like the back of my hand. At least, I thought I did. It all started in late September when we got reports of a missing tourist group, a family of 4 from Minnesota who hadn't returned from their hiking trip. This wasn't too unusual. We got a few missing persons cases each year, though most turned up within a day or two. But something felt different about this one. Maybe it was because they were experienced hikers, or maybe it was because they'd vanished from an area I patrolled regularly. Either way, my gut told me something wasn't right. A week after the first group vanished, another group of hikers disappeared from the same area. This time it was 3 college students who were camping over their fall break. What made it really strange was that we found their tents still set up, with their phones, wallets, and backpacks inside. Their campfire was cold, but their food was still laid out like they'd just been about to make dinner. It was as if they'd just disappeared into thin air. I started spending more time in that area, looking for any clues. That's when I found something that made my skin crawl, an old metal cross, green with age, definitely not something from our time. Next to it was a rusty sword handle that looked Spanish, like something the conquistadors would have used hundreds of years ago. I'd studied enough history to know this wasn't normal. These kinds of artifacts had never been found in this part of the canyon before. But what really got to me was my compass. Every time I went near this one particular cliff face, it would go crazy, spinning in circles like it was near a powerful magnet. My radio would crackle with static, and my GPS would show me in completely wrong locations. I've been in the canyon for years, but I'd never seen anything like this. One evening, as the sun was setting and the shadows were getting long, I noticed something odd about that cliff face. There was a crack I'd never seen before, and when I shone my flashlight into it, it seemed to go much deeper than it should have. Little did I know, I was about to discover something that would turn my whole world upside down. After getting proper climbing gear and backup radio equipment, I decided to investigate that crack in the cliff. I squeezed through it, expecting to find just another small cave. But what I found made me question everything I knew about the Grand Canyon. The crack opened into a narrow canyon that wasn't on any of our maps. That alone was weird enough. We had every inch of the Grand Canyon mapped out. But this place was wrong in ways I can't fully explain. The walls didn't look right. You know how when you look up at canyon walls they make sense? These didn't. Sometimes they seemed to lean in at impossible angles, and when I looked away and then back again, they seemed different, like they'd moved while I wasn't watching. I took photos with my digital camera, but every time I checked them, the images were blurry or completely black. I tried making a video, but the camera kept shutting off by itself. The worst part was the silence. The Grand Canyon is never really quiet. There's always wind or birds or something. But here, it was like being in a soundproof room. I found more Spanish artifacts scattered around, old pieces of armor, broken pottery, and tattered pages from what looked like a journal. The writing was faded, but I could make out words like El Diablo, the devil, and no escape. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Recent items, too. A Minnesota Twins baseball cap that had to belong to the missing family. A college backpack with a 1999 parking permit. The deeper I went, the more my head started to hurt. The walls seemed to pulse and breathe. I kept seeing movement out of the corner of my eye, but whenever I turned to look, nothing was there. I knew I should turn back, but I had to find those missing people. I just had to. I checked my watch. It was 4:30 p.m. I knew I had about 2 hours of daylight left. But somehow the sky above this hidden canyon was already dark, like late night. My flashlight beam seemed to bend in weird ways, sometimes shining around corners it shouldn't have been able to reach. That's when I heard it, the first real sound in this place. It was like whispers, but not in any language I knew. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice sounded flat, like I was speaking into a pillow. As I turned a corner, I saw something that still haunts my dreams. The canyon walls ahead of me were shifting, not like a rock slide. They were moving like waves in water, rippling and flowing. And in the middle of it all, there was something darker than the darkness around it. It was like a hole in the world, but it had shape. It had purpose. It moved toward me, and the whispers got louder. The ground under my feet started to tilt and spin. My flashlight flickered and died, but I could still see this thing clearly. It was like it was made of the opposite of light. The worst part was that it kept changing shape. One moment it looked like a tall human figure, the next like some kind of animal, then like something I don't even have words for. I tried to run, but the canyon walls kept changing. Paths that were there a second ago disappeared. Corridors twisted into dead ends. It was like being in a maze that kept redrawing itself. And all the while, that thing kept getting closer. I don't really remember what happened next, it's all a blur. But I do remember the moment it caught up to me. The thing stood right in front of me, and I felt like my brain was being turned inside out. It didn't speak, not with words, but somehow I understood what it was showing me. I saw visions of all the others who had found this place. The Spanish conquistadors, the missing tourists, the college students, all of them trapped in some kind of twisted reality where normal rules didn't work anymore. Then it reached for me, not with hands, but with shadows that felt ice cold. I remember screaming, and something in my pocket got hot. It was that old Spanish cross I'd found earlier. The thing pulled back like it had been burned. Without thinking, I held the cross out in front of me and ran. I ran and ran, not knowing if I was going deeper into the canyon or toward the exit. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I saw a crack of normal daylight. I squeezed through what felt like an impossibly narrow gap in the rocks, scraping my arms and shoulders raw. Then suddenly, I was back in the normal world, falling to my knees in the familiar red dust of the Grand Canyon. The sun was setting, the real sun this time. My watch said only 3 hours had passed, but it felt like days. When I looked back at the cliff face, the crack I'd gone through was gone, just smooth rock, like it had never been there at all. Of course, no one believed me. I tried to show them my photos, but every single one was just black. The videos were all corrupted. The scrapes and bruises on my body were real enough, but they said I must have gotten them from a regular climbing accident. When I took other rangers to the spot, we couldn't find the crack in the cliff anymore. The Spanish cross I'd been holding, gone, like it had never existed. I kept trying to convince people. I showed them my compass going crazy near that cliff, but they said it must be broken. I told them about the shifting walls and the dark thing, but that only made them look at me with pity in their eyes. When I couldn't sleep for days and kept seeing shadows move in the corner of my eye, they said I was having a breakdown. That's how I ended up here at Pine Grove. The doctors are nice enough, and they listen to my story, but I can see it in their eyes. They think I'm crazy. Maybe I am. Maybe that's what that thing does to you. Makes you question everything you thought you knew about reality. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. People are still going missing in that part of the canyon. Not many, just 1 or 2 a year. The official reports say they probably got lost or fell, but I know better. That thing is still out there, in its impossible canyon, waiting for more people to find that crack in the wall. And sometimes, late at night, I hear those whispers again, calling me back to Devil's Canyon.